A cardinal is laid to rest in Chicago. We'll remember Francis Cardinal George with his collaborator and friend, editor of the Catholic Thing, Robert Royal. And later, new recruiting tactics are being used to lure Muslims to join the Islamic State, just as American warships head to the Arabian Sea. Congressman RON DESANTis of the House Foreign Relations Committee is here with the latest. And finally, actor Eduardo Verastegui joins me in studio to discuss his new family film, Little Boy, which hits theaters this weekend. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Congressman RON DESANTis, Robert Royal, and Eduardo Verastegui are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's program, send your tweet to Raymond Arroyo, or you can email us at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's go to the brief news from the world over this week. The jihad of the Islamic State continues, starting in Libya. Another round of Christian executions. In a grisly video released Sunday, jihadists are seen shooting and beheading two groups of Ethiopian men, 28 in total. These killings echo the beheadings of 21 Coptic Christians that made headlines in February. In the latest massacre, the victims are described as followers of the cross of the enemy Ethiopian church. The victims were migrants trying to reach Europe. The released footage also showed churches and Christian cemeteries being destroyed. Christians are warned in the video to convert to Islam or face a similar fate. The video release came a day after 35 were killed in a suicide attack in Afghanistan, in what appears to be a new front emerging for the Islamic State. The Afghani president blamed the attack on ISIS and is warning that foreign fighters are pouring into the country to help the Taliban. Meanwhile, in Iraq, multiple deadly bomb attacks were reported in and around Baghdad. Thousands have fled the city of Ramadi, just outside Baghdad, as ISIS militants have overrun large portions of that city. More on ISIS, its growing reach around the world, and in the U.S. later in the show. And tragedy struck in the Mediterranean Sea as the European migrant crisis continues to escalate. As many as 900 are believed dead after an overcrowded fishing vessel capsized off the coast of Sicily. It was the deadliest shipwreck ever in the Mediterranean. The Italian government has rescued over 10,000 people from the Mediterranean in just the last 2 weeks, an unprecedented number. Since Pope Francis's outreach to Middle Eastern and African migrants at the start of his pontificate, the numbers of those choosing to cross the treacherous waters to Italy have exploded, as have the number of deaths. The mortality rate of Mediterranean migrants this year is already in the thousands, nearly double that of 2014 and 2013 figures. An emergency EU summit convened in Brussels on Thursday to address the crisis. In a related story, police in Sicily this week arrested 15 Muslim migrants for allegedly throwing 12 Christians overboard during a voyage from Libya. Tearful survivors told Palermo police about the attacks. They claim they only survived after chaining themselves together and fighting to stay on board. The Muslims are being charged with multiple murders aggravated by religious hate. And on Wednesday, French authorities said they foiled an imminent attack on several churches after a man was arrested with an arsenal of weapons. The 24-year-old Algerian computer science student was detained on Sunday after he shot himself in the leg. Police followed a trail of blood to his car, where they found the weapons. The Interior Minister of France said the documents found in the suspect's home prove that he was preparing an attack on one or two churches. The suspect was also arrested in connection with the death of a 32-year-old French woman who was found shot to death in her car Sunday morning. Back here in Washington, Republicans are claiming a pro-life victory in the U.S. Senate. A once uncontroversial human trafficking bill stalled when Democrats and Republicans could not come to terms. It finally passed overwhelmingly on Wednesday. The bill initially allocated fines collected from sex criminals to help victims, including medical expenses, but it would not fund abortion. Democrats balked at the exclusion. Under compromise language, all victims' medical expenses will now be allocated from community health center funds, which are already abortion restricted. As part of the deal, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell agreed to clear a confirmation vote for President Obama's Attorney General nominee, Loretta Lynch. And the Vatican has released a few additions to Pope Francis's scheduled September visit to the United States. The Holy See press office announced this week the Pope will travel to Cuba before coming to the United States. The addition of the Cuba visit portends a trip that could be as pastoral as it is political. The lifting of the U.S. embargo against Cuba remains largely unpopular here on Capitol Hill, fueling speculation that the Pope could use his address before a joint session of Congress to urge the end of the long-standing U.S. embargo. The president cannot remove the embargo unilaterally. The Vatican has offered no other details regarding the Cuba visit or its timing. The Vatican also confirmed this week that Pope Francis will canonize Blessed Junipero Serra in Washington, D.C. Blessed Junipero Serra was a Franciscan friar who established the California missions and secured a Bill of Rights for Native peoples. He will become the first United States Hispanic saint. The canonization is scheduled for September 23rd outside the National Shrine here in D.C. EWTN News will, of course, bring you live, comprehensive coverage of Pope Francis's historic visit to the U.S. and Cuba. And Cardinal Francis George, the retired Archbishop of Chicago and the first native Chicagoan to lead the Archdiocese, died April 17th after a nearly 10-year battle with cancer. He was 78. The Cardinal overcame many obstacles in his life, including a childhood bout with polio that left him with a weakened leg and a significant limp. Not that that slowed him down. He was ordained to the Oblates of Mary Immaculate in 1963 and went on to become Bishop of Yakima, Washington, Archbishop of Portland, Oregon, and finally Archbishop of Chicago in 1997. In 2007, Cardinal George was elected president of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. Throughout his term in Chicago, George was a leading figure in the U.S. Church, overseeing the New English translation of the Mass, the zero-tolerance policy for sex abuse by clergy, and the bishop's opposition to the abortion contraceptive provisions in Obamacare. Regarded as one of the greatest minds in the American Church, George was known for his clarity and sharp wit. Cardinal George's funeral mass was celebrated on Thursday at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago. Per his wishes, he was buried in a family plot in Illinois. We'll have more on the life and legacy of Francis Cardinal George with Robert Royal later in the show. May Cardinal George rest in peace. On Tuesday, Pope Francis accepted the resignation of Bishop Robert Finn as head of the Diocese of Kansas City, St. Joseph in Missouri. 3 years ago, Bishop Finn became the highest-ranking U.S. Catholic clergyman to be convicted for failing to report a suspected child abuser. Finn was convicted on one misdemeanor count for failing to report to authorities a priest who was found with lewd photographs of young girls on his computer. Bishop Finn's resignation comes as Pope Francis continues to face pressure from the faithful and members of his own Sex Abuse Commission to show that he's serious about holding bishops accountable when they've mishandled or protected child abusers. When we return, a member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Ron DeSantis, is here. He'll discuss the latest developments in ISIS and their recruiting techniques, the proposed nuke deal with Iran, and much more when The World Over Live continues. And later, actor Eduardo Verastegui introduces us to Little Boy. Stay tuned.
What this case shows is that the person radicalizing your son, your brother, your friend may not be a stranger. It may be their best friend right here in town. And your brother, your son, your relative could be talking to Avni Noor in Syria, who is providing inspiration and ideas for how to get to Syria.
That is Andrew Lugar. He is the U.S. Attorney of Minnesota, explaining the arrests of 6 individuals charged with plotting to join ISIS. For more on the radicalization here at home and the recruitment of U.S. citizens and immigrants, as well as the Iranian nuclear deal, we are joined by Florida Representative and a member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Congressman Ron DeSantis. Congressman, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking the time out. Let's start talking about this peer-to-peer recruitment. This seems to be a new phenomenon. A lot of these Somali immigrants, it seems to have run through the Somali community. There was another story about a 23-year-old who trained in Syria, and the imam sent him back and said, go carry out your jihad there in the United States.
Well,
what do we do here?
We actually, in Florida, we had the first American suicide bomber in Syria was from South Florida, and he went to Syria, he did terrorist training, he came back to South Florida unimpeded, government didn't have any information on what he was doing, and then he went back and conducted a suicide attack. And that's concerning because these are people that we should be monitoring. The Somali situation in Minnesota, this is a whole community. They have funneled multiple people over to ISIS in the Middle East, and they're waging jihad, and this individual obviously came back. Many of them are still in the fight. So you seem to have a situation which is really toxic brew of jihadism. So you're taking people who are already predisposed to that and then just giving them a platform to go wage jihad, or you're taking people and actually radicalizing them because they're in this community where that is something that is being done.
What is fueling all of this? I mean, why are these young people particularly drawn to it? Whether it's the guy in France who was going to blow up the churches and shot himself and was captured by authorities, or these 6 individuals. What's driving them in the midst of civil Western societies to want to go out and give their lives in this cause?
Well, I think the difference between what we see now with ISIS and maybe what we saw with Al-Qaeda in the 90s is with the internet, with social media, if you're somebody who is disposed to want to accept kind of the jihadist worldview, that can be put right in front of you. And it's attractive for some people in a way that I think would have been much more difficult to imagine in, say, the mid-1990s. Not that there weren't people being radicalized, but I just think the pool of people who are now exposed to this is so much greater. And I think that's why you're seeing more people end up going in that direction.
Yeah. I want to talk for a moment about this Iranian deal. We've been seeing, of course, this play out over many days. In June, there will be a final pact, meat on the bones, if you will, of this primary agreement that everybody's already seeming to circle around. Congress has some oversight. They can vote the deal up or down when it comes out in June. Is that sufficient in your mind?
Well, here's the thing. We don't even know if there's a framework. We have not been even given the framework.
Nothing more than what we've seen in the press.
Exactly. And we're told maybe it's locked away somewhere, classified. We need to, we're the representatives of the American people. We need to at least see this framework. So we don't even know if there's a legitimate framework, if there was a meeting of minds on the framework, and who knows what's going to happen, whether there's a final signed deal. I'm skeptical that there will even be a signed deal. I think what you'll end up seeing is the president saying, oh, we've kind of reached an understanding, and kind of do that. That way, from his judgment, Congress won't even be in a position to pass judgment on the agreement. And it goes right back to Tom Cotton's letter, because he made the point, said, look, this is not going to be binding if Congress doesn't approve it. The next president could change it. So that very well may be where we're going. I mean, I think that what you want is, if you're going to bind the country internationally, that either needs to be approved in the Senate with 2/3 as a treaty, or it's got to just be a normal law of the land, go through both houses and sign. If he's not doing that, then to me, yes, he can conduct himself consistent with those promises, but that is not going to be binding for our country going forward.
The Ayatollah wants the sanctions lifted tomorrow. The moment after they agree to a deal, they want the sanctions lifted. One of the biggest problems is this doesn't seem to be tied to those 4 Americans that are sitting in an Iranian jail right now, a pastor, a Marine, a contractor. What do we do here? Should we be making a deal with Iran when you can't even send inspectors in? Inspectors tried to get into a military facility. They were turned away.
No, absolutely. And it's really less than a deal than a list of concessions because, as you say, we're not talking about the Americans who are detained. We know Iran is still the leading state sponsor of terrorism. That's not a part of the negotiations at all. We see what they're doing to foment unrest in Yemen. We know they're going to send weapons to the Houthis, and that's a major international incident. We're like, oh, that's not going to be a part of the nuclear negotiation. So how would you trust a country who you see is such a destructive force throughout the world?
Yeah, well, we've got warships in place in Yemen. Now, they say, the White House is saying, the Pentagon is saying, this is just to make sure that the lanes remain open here. What do you think's going on there with those warships?
Well, look, I think that those warships need to be there. I think you are going to see Iran try to provide more arms to the Houthis.
To the Houthi rebels.
They want Yemen to be another Shiite Iranian sphere of influence. I mean, if you notice, they're the leading patron of the in the Gaza Strip for Hamas. They're the leading patron of Lebanese Hezbollah. They're the leading patron of Assad in Syria. Unfortunately, they're taking over more and more parts of Iraq with the Shiite militias. And then Yemen, I mean, they could emerge from the Obama presidency as by far the dominant power in the Middle East.
The administration says, look, you can't just keep sending troops to the Middle East. We have to work with the allies in the region, and we have to diplomatically engage even these long-term enemies. You would say what?
Well, look, I mean, we were in a position of strength. The sanctions regime was hurting Iran. It was hurting their economy. It was weakening the regime. They desperately wanted that relief.
Right.
In the House, what we did 18 months ago, we saw that and we said, this is a rogue regime. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to increase the sanctions and tighten it even more so that they come begging for us so that we'll accept their concessions. Instead, what the president did was he did sanctions relief unilaterally, thinking here's a gesture of good faith and that the mullahs will then return the favor. But that is not the way they think, and that is not the way they're constructed. And so they pocket the concessions, and now they're getting away with really a disarmament by us.
Speaking of sanctions and embargoes, I want to talk about Cuba for a moment. The Pope just announced he's going to go to Cuba before he comes to the United States in September. There is no doubt he will very likely raise that issue when he's here before a joint session of Congress, having just come back from Cuba. He will make the plea. His predecessors have as well. This embargo needs to be lifted. But now he was kind of the engineer. He was the one who's facilitated these talks, so there's a personal stake in it as well. What do you say?
Well, look, we know what happens with other countries that trade with Cuba. It goes to the Cuban military and the Cuban regime. And so unless there's something that changes, which would show me that actually it would benefit the Cuban people who've been oppressed for 50 years, I'm not interested, because I think what we're doing is we're increasing power of the Castro dictatorship. And these guys are getting old. I mean, I would like to see a transition to a more representative form of government, but if you're strengthening them in power, I think it's going to make it easier for them to hand off power to another strongman. So that's my concern with it. I would love to change the policy if it benefited the people in Cuba who are actually fighting for freedom.
Mm-hmm. I want to play something for you. This is President Obama. He was talking to Chris Matthews about his foreign policy. Listen.
I remind people that there actually is probably less war and less violence around the world today than there might have been 30, 40 years ago.
Your reaction?
Well, let's look back at when this president came office. Now, he got a Nobel Peace Prize, right? It's just basically for being elected, I guess. Look at what the world looks like since he took office. The Middle East has gone south. Iraq is in way worse shape. Libya is a haven for terrorists. Syria is just a total catastrophe. Yemen. And then even the people who are allies like Israel, we have a worse relationship with Israel. And Egypt, General Sisi trying to do the right thing. The administration still does not embrace what he's trying to do. So the idea that somehow things were worse 20 or 30 years ago, I just don't think that washes. And I think the American people look at the news they see on their TV sets and they see all the unrest, and I think that they just shake their head.
I want to jump around to a couple of quick issues before I let you go. You are in the reserves, we should tell people, served in the Navy, you were a prosecutor for a while, and you're still in the reserves. There's a story about this Navy chaplain, this chaplain Motter, who in a private session with soldiers, cautioned against premarital sex, I guess said that gay marriage is not a good idea, coming from his personal convictions, his religious prerogative. He has been basically relieved of duty, 19-year veteran, a decorated man, and it has had a chilling effect on the chaplaincy. What should be done here? What should Congress be doing?
Well, look, we need to be upholding the First Amendment, and that means the free exercise of religion. You have Orthodox doctrine in the Catholic faith or in the Protestant faith. The idea that all of a sudden that's not going to be something that could even be discussed in those settings, I think is troubling, and that's not how the chaplain corps was working when I was on active duty, and I know a lot of members of Congress are concerned about it.
What about women in the military? There was a big push in the last few years. Leon Panetta announced it before he left at the Pentagon, that women will be moved into these elite fighting forces. Well, it turns out in the infantry officer course that the Marines offer, 29 women tried to get through the course. 0 were successful in making it through. Should the standards be lowered to achieve this goal of allowing women into these special forces, and what might be the result?
No, look, the standards are the highest standards in those units, and they have to remain the highest standards. And women have done a great job in a lot of areas, but you can't change the standard. I mean, for example, we have female fighter pilots. They don't have lower standards. They have to meet the same standards. And I think certainly when you start talking about Army Special Forces, when you start talking about these elite Marine Corps units, Navy SEALs, the standards have got to remain high.
Yeah, and you can't have a person in there. What my thought is, you put a woman in the midst of those Navy SEALs, and I know you know them, I know some of these guys too, their first instinct is going to be to protect that woman, it seems to me, no matter what the situation is. It does create a dynamic that is very different from what they're dealing with now.
Well, and the thing is look, when you talk about standards, I mean, most men who do the Navy, try to do the Navy SEALs, they don't even come close. Exactly. Right. So you just, when you put anybody in there, male or female, who wasn't able to meet the standards, that is just totally verboten in that type of elite unit, because they need to depend on everybody with their lives.
Congressman DeSantis, thanks so much
Thanks for having me.
We'll have you back. When the World Over Live continues, we'll remember Cardinal Francis George with his friend and colleague Robert Royal, and Eduardo Verastegui will tell us about his new film, Little Boy. Stay right there. Thank you.
You are not really a good person if you don't accept abortion as a universal human right, not just a rare and tragic circumstance. If you in any way dare to say that not homosexual persons, but homosexual activity is somehow not ordered correctly according to the will of God or of nature, these things are now formative of all of us, and particularly younger people, in such a way that the faith becomes more and more incomprehensible. In other words, are the media creating a culture where it is practically impossible to believe, in which case it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to be Catholic in this culture in 20, 30, 40 years. There is an implausibility to the faith now that wasn't there 20 years ago, and that's because largely of the entertainment media.
That was Cardinal Francis George. Welcome back to the World Over. He's been called a lion of the American church, a man of deep intelligence, not untouched by suffering. He was the first native Chicagoan to lead that diocese, and he did so for 17 years until his retirement. Cardinal Francis George was laid to rest on Thursday. Joining us to talk about this monumental figure, his legacy, and a few other matters is editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal. Robert, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. We heard there that sort of penetrating grasp that Cardinal Francis George had of the American scene and the global scene. What was it like working with him? You collaborated with him on a number of books.
Well, you heard it in that soundbite. There's a broadness of mind, but also a depth of mind and a practicality about what's going on in the world. And he knew that the walls were closing in for the church. And it's not simply the media, it's the universities. He's talked about that. It's the federal government. And the problem starts to be that how does the church even communicate itself other than EWTN? And it's almost like samizdat under the old Soviet Union. We have some methods of communication, but the large parts of the culture now are occupied by what you have to think of as a kind of a counter-Christian culture.
Tell me for a moment, in your estimation, was he the greatest mind in the bishops' conference?
Yeah, I think that goes undisputed, and I think many bishops would say that as well. He was the guy who many people who do intellectual work, you talk with him for 2 minutes, and he's not only talking about Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle, but he's talking about American philosophers. He had a PhD in American philosophy. He was talking about William James and Josiah Royce and others. So he knew at great depth what was going on, but also connected with people in a remarkable way.
At his heart, it seemed to me, and I knew Cardinal George from meeting him over the years. I didn't know him with the intimacy that you did. It seemed to me he was a traditionalist at heart. He walked into what was, I don't think it's going out on a limb to say, the toxic waste dump of Bernardin's Chicago. It was a mess. Did he make a dent in the diocese? And what impact do you think he had while there?
Well, I don't live in Chicago, and I think people out there probably need to speak to that. You know, he used to to tell a joke, but it was a true joke, that before he ever thought he would go back to Chicago, he ran into Cardinal Bernardin once and said to him, "Joe, how do you govern a place like Chicago?" And Bernardin started laughing, and he said, "Govern Chicago? Are you kidding? It's by nature ungovernable. Nobody governs Chicago." So it's not even a matter of Cardinal Bernardin was more liberal and Cardinal George was more traditional, if that's the right term for it. It's a place that has for a very long time had its own ideas about what Catholicism is. And I believe that he, just by his example and by the brilliance of his presence, that made a big difference. But I hear from many people that they feel that still, in spite of it, as some people say about John Paul II and about Pope Benedict, that as great as they were, the Church didn't really make the turn that they had hoped for.
Of course, he established that community of St. John Cantius downtown there. And
appointed Father Robert Barron to the Mundelein Seminary, who's just been a brilliant apologist for the faith.
So there are certain bits of the legacy that remain there. I want to talk a moment about his disability, which he and I talked about. I'll play this bite. I want your reaction. I know you walk with some difficulty due to a bout with polio as a child. Can you tell us how that has affected the way you've carried your office in Chicago and the way you'll carry yourself as a cardinal?
I mean, I've come to terms with it, I think, long ago, so it's not going to affect what I do here any differently than it affected what I did elsewhere. I come, I suppose, with a certain sensitivity to physical and also mental and psychological disabilities, a sense of identification. I'm the national moderator, the Episcopal moderator for the National Catholic Office for People with Disabilities. I'm very interested in the disability community because I'm part of it. So that necessarily affects perhaps my mission, but it also helps me to, I think, come to terms with limits. I've tried to do that through my life because you're limited. And also an appreciation of the way in which weakness has to be visible in the community in order to call forth the generosity of others.
He did have a real heart for the disabled community.
Yeah, I'm not from Chicago, but I used to go out quite a bit, and when we would be working on the books, I would go out to dinners with him or events of one sort or another, and it was remarkable to me how much drive he had. That, I'm a considerably younger man than he was when he died, and at the end of the day, he was still raring to go, and he was out there. And it's because I think, as many people who have handicaps and have overcome them do, he just became very dedicated, and he decided that he wouldn't let it stop him. And Father Robert Barron has said that the very first lecture that he or talk he gave to the priests of the Archdiocese of Chicago, as Archbishop of Chicago, he said to them, "Never feel sorry for yourself." In other words, you've got a beautiful mission, you've got a beautiful vocation, and I think that energized with him, with whoever he was. And I've seen it with ordinary groups, Catholic and non-Catholic, who just warmed to him because they knew that that was a real part of him.
He really did not like the politicization of the church. We talked about that. Listen to this and please react. Can you lament the politicization of everything, how we see everything now through these political prisms? To what do you attribute that? How did we get here?
Part of it might be that so many other areas of civil society that make up a culture are now weakened, the family particularly, and politics then, instead of being the part of our public life that governs part of our life, citizens, but there's a whole civil society is much broader than that, has been allowed to move into areas that it has no business being in, including the church. So political and conservative polarization, those are political, or liberal, those are political terms, they're not ecclesiastical terms. For us, the terms are true and false, or good and evil. Those are the divisions that count.
True and false, good and evil.
Yeah, and I heard him talk about this many times, and we had private conversations quite often about it. But part of the difficulty is that the church, with its claims to truth, also has to be able to enter into the public square. I mean, he has at the beginning of his book, God in Action, he disclaims that the church is outside, or that God is outside, that it's always at work inside of everything, because God is present, and the church needs to be present to all sectors of society, the whole universe for that matter. But the difficulty is, with these truths that the church has, how can it speak? Where can it act? So it has got to find some allies in the public square. And this, unfortunately, because of the domination of the political process in these days, and the lack of civil society, the lack of the church's own instruments to speak. This means that we're constantly looking for allies who can speak for us in the public square, and unfortunately that means the political parties. And the political parties, God love them, have their value and their disvalue.
Yeah, and their own agenda many times. He had this quote, you wrote of this in your remembrance of him that I'm going to put on the Facebook page. It's so beautiful and moving. The quote you mentioned, and I do think he'll be remembered for this, is, I expect to die in my bed, my successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. His successor will pick up the shards of the ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history. Is that being dramatic or prophetic?
I used to joke with him that when his health was good, that maybe he was a little too optimistic, because dying in his bed at times didn't seem like what was going to even happen for him.
Yeah.
But maybe the generations are a little bit too short. I think that we're very likely, and I'm just guessing as any of us would at this point, but it seems to me that the church is going to pass through more than just 1 or 2 generations before it gets its chance to make a turn. The country is in serious trouble. It's in serious trouble internally. It's in serious trouble internationally. And the contrast, as he said, between, say, the 1980s and 1990s, when Father Richard John Newhouse could talk about a Catholic moment in the United States, couldn't be starker. It's hard to know where the church, where even Christianity, in a more general sense, can find a place to present itself, a foothold or a grip in this sort of culture. So. I think that progression is right. The church has survived the fall of whole civilizations, the Roman Empire, the medieval synthesis. So we'll come back. But how quickly we'll come back, I think he might have been a little optimistic.
In November, this past November, we spoke. It was the last interview I did with him. And we talked about Pope Francis and the last synod. He had this to say.
If there was some difficulty in interpreting what was going on, I think it was more because of what was hinted at. That is, they didn't follow the rules.
No.
I mean, they didn't follow the Vademecum. They didn't follow. So the methodology seemed up for grabs. The church is not up for grabs, but the way of doing a synod suddenly seems to be very uncertain. You have a plan for synods, and it's not being followed. Yeah. And some of the report, for example, that
midterm report,
evidently it did not reflect what was being said. Now, how did that happen? That has not been answered yet, and that's going to be a question that should be pursued. So it isn't that the church is up for grabs, it's that this synod's method didn't follow the book, and so people didn't know what to expect next.
People didn't know what to expect next. He was disturbed about the direction of the church at the end.
Well, as you know, Raymond, he also made several public statements about how the Holy Father, he wished he could speak with the Holy Father because he wasn't sure that the people around him were making clear that he was creating some confusion by some of the things that he said. It wasn't that Cardinal George believed that he was actually teaching things that were contrary to the faith. It's just that people were unclear. I think what you also hear in that soundbite is him, the man who was the president of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, who knew that Robert's Rules of Order, that the procedures that are necessary to run a meeting are quite important because they help with the outcome. That if what you begin to do is to sort of improvise along the way, well, then these sorts of disorders and things get inserted. And as you know, I was in Rome when that interim report came out, and everyone was shocked, including the veteran reporters in Rome themselves. And then the very next day, the bishops themselves came out and did a 180-degree turn and said, that's not what we were talking about, that this somehow was slipped into the actual text, and they more or less denied that, and in the final report, we got something that was better. But the procedure, a man who had actually worked in a circumstance where an organization has to follow an orderly procedure, he knew that that was an important part of getting to and proclaiming the truth.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's sad he wasn't stronger in those last days. He would have been the perfect person to go and be one of the American representatives at this synod. He reflected at the end of our interview on how God was preparing him for eternity. Listen to this.
I think the Lord, in His goodness, prepares us to meet Him face to face, by stripping away a lot of accoutrements of life and desires, even good desires, so that in the end there's one thing necessary, that is the love of God. And I kind of sense that I'm being helped in that way, that the Lord is preparing me, despite my unworthiness, to meet Him. Because it's when you stop to think about it, what does that mean? To see God, we say. We can't see without eyes. So what are we talking about? It's a true vision. We say, how does the spirit see? Because we're part spirit, and that's the part that survives death until the resurrection. So there are just all kinds of questions that I can't answer. You can't, I don't think. St. Thomas couldn't, exactly.
No.
So there's all that to be considered as you try to say, what must I do to prepare for death? The importance of your life is that it prepares you to live forever with God. And so it's very important that at the end of your life, you can sum it up and hand it over to Him. Here it is, Lord. Purify me and help me.
I love the end of that. Purify me and help me. What's his final legacy, do you think?
Well, that is one of them. I mean, I'm going to make a bold comparison. It reminds me a little bit of St. Thomas Aquinas at the end of his life when he said, all I have written is as straw. Right. So, these great world-class intellectual figures who are really spiritual men know at the end of the day that it comes down to being able to hand yourself, to commend your own spirit to God. I think he leaves the church with a certain pride in the way that the episcopacy, the American episcopacy, can conduct itself. It hasn't always done that. No organization ever is 100% perfect. But he was certainly one of the men. He was the head of his own religious order, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and was involved in missionary work on 6 different continents, which he used to talk about quite a bit. It was that great period of that open America that went out into the world and preached the gospel and kept the faith here at home in a culture that is not always open to Catholicism. He was a great man. I have to say, it really hit me hard when the news came. I knew it was coming, but the day that I actually saw it, I really felt that something had passed not only out of my life, but out of the life of American Catholicism and America. Yeah, no, I shared that feeling. It was not unexpected, but it was sort of shocking when it happened. Before I let you go, this week Bishop Robert Finn of the Kansas City Diocese was his resignation was accepted by the Holy Father 3 years after he was convicted of not reporting a suspected child abuser. What's the message here? Well, I think it's hard to even predict. It's the beginning of what could be just a waterfall of prosecutions and recriminations. I think this is a very unfortunate case. It wasn't as if he had been protecting people for a long time. He's only been a bishop for
10 years, not even 10 years.
Like that. And there was this one case that unfortunately was poorly handled. It said that he got bad advice, but in this day and age, the bishops of the United States have to be extremely careful. I mean, I know bishops who say they check with police about certain cases, but then they keep checking week after week after week to make sure that there are no further developments, because they're the ones who are blamed, even if there's a police error.
Yeah, no, this is an odd case because, I mean, you're dealing with a case here where you didn't actually have a child abuser. You had a perverted guy, you had somebody taking weird pictures, and, you know, certainly not an upstanding priest. He should have been removed. He's serving 50 years in prison and should be. But the question is, how complicit was Finn? Did he know? I can think of other cases right off the top of my head in America and Europe where they knew of actual pederasts and nothing was done, or they were moved parish to parish. Some of them are still in service today. So we'll see what the Holy Father does. It's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Robert Royal, thank you for being here. You can find Robert's columns at catholicthing.org. When we return, we'll talk about the new film Little Boy with one of its stars and executive producer Eduardo Verastegui. The World of Our Life continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
My next guest was the star of the movie Bella, and more recently, Paul Blart Mall Cop 2. Tonight he returns to discuss his latest project, a labor of love that deals with faith, hope, and family. It's called Little Boy. In it, an 8-year-old is willing to do whatever it takes to end World War II so his father can return home. He sat down with me recently here in Washington to discuss this very sweet story about a boy's love for his father and the power of faith. Here's my exclusive interview with Eduardo Verastegui. This Little Boy is an interesting movie. I mean, it deals in faith, its belief. It's got this magical realism element in it that I never expected. Where did this story come from?
Alejandro Monteverde and Pepe Portillo.
Who's the director?
The director and the writer. And 3 years, it took 3 years of their lives, you know, to write Little Boy, 15 hours every day. And finally, when they gave me the script, I read it and I was moved, I was touched, I cried, and I told them, you know, let's do it.
What was the idea? What was the first germ of this idea? Because this is a little boy, his father goes off to war, he's his best friend, his partner, he keeps calling him throughout the movie.
You know, all in his head. One day he was writing another script with Pepe Portillo, and 2 weeks later they were very depressed because the script wasn't, I mean, the story was not there. And next thing you know, they were watching this documentary on World War II, because the movie, as you know, it takes place in the 40s in a very little town in California in front of the ocean, World War II against Japan. And they were watching this documentary, and from there, all fiction, all in their heads. Wow. 3 years later, you know, again, when I read that, I said, I need to produce this. This is, because, you know, when I opened my production company with Leo and Alejandro, the first fruit of that goal, of that dream of trying to make trying to make movies that will have the potential not only to entertain but to make a difference was Bella.
Right.
So after Bella, I was waiting for another project, for another story that will somehow, you know, will change people's lives for the better. Because that's my hope as a filmmaker, that when people see our movies, they leave the theater not only entertained, but, you know, inspired to love more and judge less, inspired to forgive more and complain less, inspired to do great things with their lives, right? And Little Boy has all that and more. Yeah. And that's what I just went crazy, and I said to Alejandro, you know what, I want to do this. And he said to me, go and raise the money.
And off you did.
But the hardest thing was not just to raise the money. I mean, that was a miracle, of course. You know, it's the most expensive film, independent film in history, shot in Mexico. Wow. The hardest thing was to find the little boy. We saw like 1,000 kids, Raymond, 1,000 kids, because the casting director told us, you can make a lot of mistakes in this movie, but the one mistake that you cannot make is to cast the wrong kid, because the entire movie will collapse. So we're like looking at, you know, kids in Texas, in New York, in California, finally, one day we saw 30 kids in line, and Jacob Salvati, little boy now, he was there with the long hair. He looked like a surfer. He was, joking around and playing with everyone. When we finished the auditions, we find out that actually he was not there to do an audition. He was there with his older brother who has autism. He was autistic. And somehow the doctors recommended his parents to take him to auditions as a therapy because he has an amazing photographic memory. So the younger brother was there just waiting. So Alejandro said, I want to see this kid. So the casting director, you got to be kidding me. I mean, this kid is only 7 years old. I mean, you should be looking for someone that is 11 who looks like 7 because you want the maturity. No, I want to see this kid. So we saw Jacob for 9 times, 9 callbacks. And at the end, we gave him the hardest scene. He came back prepared. Everybody was crying. Alejandro, stop. You're a little boy. This is your movie. This is your movie. The kid is looking at us like with his mouth open, and his older brother starts crying. And we're like, oh my gosh, he's jealous. No, I'm trying to fix things. This is for both of you. The whole movie is for the whole family. And he's looking at us and he's saying, you don't understand, sir. We're very thankful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're very poor. And then we find out that in real life, they were losing their home. So the older brother was thankful because his younger brother, Jacob, saved their home in real life.
How? How are you going to bring Dad back, you idiot?
Like with the mustard seed. You can move a mountain.
Fine. You want to move a mountain? There's one. Go ahead. Move it. Move it! Move it for everyone! Calm down.
Beautiful performance, and he is the heart of it. And he's surrounded by great people. You've got Tom Wilkerson, you've got Emma Watson, you've got Kevin James, yourself. I mean, it's an amazing cast.
David Henry, who is an amazing actor,
Who had he says this saved his life, this movie. Changed his life, helped him rediscover his faith. What did it do to your life?
Well, you know what? When I read the script, I felt like I'm from a very small town, just like little boy. I was the underdog. All my friends were, older than me and bigger than me, so I know what bullying, being bullied. And but I'm a big dreamer, just like little boy. This movie changed your life because this movie is designed, Raymond, is designed to wake up the little boy that we all have in our hearts. That somehow, when we grew up, he falls asleep. Yeah. And what I mean by that is the capacity to love big, to dream big, to forgive big, to serve big. And sometimes, it's very easy to lose hope and very easy to give up because whatever you're dreaming, the mountain is too big and you can't move that mountain, right? And these little boys somehow help you to never give up and never lose faith and hope in what you're trying to do.
And it really is about belief. And your character, Father Crispin, is sort of a straight-laced, cassock-wearing. I have to say, this is one of the spectacularly bad haircuts in maybe all of cinema.
Actually, you won't recognize me.
Goliath with the little stone. That's what we need, my friends, in these difficult times. So, like Father Oliver used to ask, what can we do? What can we do for our relatives at war? What can we do if we are here and they are there? And the answer is, if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, we can move a mountain. If we can move a mountain, then nothing will be impossible for us, not even ending this war and having our loved ones back.
I already knew someone who could move a mountain. I wondered if the source of his powers was a mustard seed.
And the entire movie is this kid trying to, this little boy trying to achieve the impossible, which is to end World War II, so he can bring his father back home alive.
And he really the kid really believes. Literally, he goes and finds a mustard seed.
And he is the mustard seed himself,
Yeah, it's a beautiful film. Now, later, the other priest in the film, Father Oliver, Tom Wilkerson, gives the little boy a list of things he should do if he really wants to bring his father back. What are they?
The ancient list: feed the hunger.
The corporal works of mercy.
Exactly. The corporal works of mercy, feed the hunger, visit those who are in prison, visit the sick, bury the dead,
clothe the naked.
Clothe the naked. And you know what, Raymond, as you know, especially young people, we have this tendency, this inclination to imitate what we see in film or television. And if that is truth, my hope is that when people see little boy, the audience will imitate the little boy list. And so we want to make sure that everyone who sees this movie, we want to challenge everyone to do the list, because I guarantee you that if we do the list, we make this world a better place.
It has a fantastical, almost fable-like quality. That's what I was so fascinated by, visually and otherwise. I mean, we go into his imagination, we see this whole world from a child's point of view, and I don't want to ruin it by saying any more, but it's an amazing kind of exploration and balance between a childlike faith and that wonder and sensibility that's willing to accept wonder. So what are you working on now? I know you were just in Mall Cop, and now you've got Little Boy. What else?
Well, you know what? Right now I'm just focusing on little boy, and little boy. I eat little boy, I drink with little boy, I wake up with it's 5 years of my life, Raymond. 5 years of my life for 1 hour, 40 minutes of your time, and I hope our movie will touch your heart.
Hey, where's your cane, Tiny Tim?
Yeah, it's really too soon to make any diagnosis. Let's just say you're a little boy.
My story takes place on the home front. That's my dad. I wanted to be just like him. Everything we did became a great adventure.
Do you believe we can do this?
Yes, I believe we can do this.
Partner, do you believe you can do this?
I believe I can do this.
Pepper, Flint, Busby, it's time to go to bed.
All was good in the old Busby home, or so I thought.
You're going to war.
Yes.
I don't want you to go. Why can't we stay together?
The moment of truth. I am searching for the chosen one.
Me!
You. The movement of an object to inner power. Do you believe you can do this?
Yes, I believe I can move it.
You wanted the bottle to move so much. It moved. Your faith is powerful.
But if I get enough faith, nothing's impossible, right? Even bringing my dad home?
Your faith won't work if you have even the slightest bit of doubt.
Want to move a mountain? There's one. Go ahead. Move it.
Was that an earthquake?
It's a miracle.
It's up to you to achieve the impossible. It takes courage to believe.
This week, Verastegui had a chance to share his film with a pretty important moviegoer. He brought a Spanish-language version to Pope Francis, and he even scored a hug. He looks like a little boy in that shot. Little Boy, produced by Eduardo Verastegui, starring Tom Wilkinson, Kevin James, and others, opens in theaters everywhere on Friday, April 24th. Be sure to see this wonderful film. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. You can also sign up for my free e-blast. I'll send you exclusive news you won't find anywhere else and links to the show segments and much more. Now, don't miss next week. The Archbishop of Aleppo will be here. He'll tell us about the sad state of his people in Syria. And Canadian columnist and author Michael Coren says Islam is at war with Christianity. Until next time, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time. Bye now.